Walk through Boston, New York, Chicago, or San Francisco and pay attention to the old buildings as you pass them. Look down at street level and you'll notice windows at your feet, half-buried doorways leading nowhere, and staircases that descend into what should be the ground floor. We call these spaces basements, but that raises a question worth asking. Why would a basement have ornate stonework, 15-foot ceilings, and chandeliers hanging from decorative plasterwork? The standard explanation goes like this. Cities raised their street levels over the years, filled in low-lying areas to prevent flooding, rebuilt after fires, and added layers of new pavement. Streets climbed higher gradually, and what used to be first floors ended up as basements. Just normal urban development, nothing unusual about it. But when you check the actual numbers, the story stops making sense. Seattle claims the city raised its streets somewhere between 15 and 30 feet, following the Great Fire of 1889. 15 feet is the height of a 2-story building, and the official account says they simply buried entire floors and built new streets on top of them. Portland has buildings with 12-foot sections underground. Galveston raised the entire city 17 feet after the 1900 hurricane wiped out 8,000 people. Chicago's downtown is filled with identical sunken buildings spread across miles of city blocks. And old Sacramento's whole historic district sits one complete story below the modern street level. These aren't stories about a few inches of settling. What we're looking at are complete architectural floors with windows, doorways, and finished stonework sitting underground. And this happened in dozens of cities across a 50-year window from 1850 to 1900. Here's what we're going to cover. The architectural evidence that shows basement windows looking identical to first-floor windows. The scale problem, specifically how much dirt you'd need to bury entire city blocks. The timeline, which shows this happening worldwide in the same narrow period. The official explanations that fall apart under examination. The labor and cost required to bury fully finished buildings on purpose. The alternative theory suggesting these buildings were already buried when people found them and dug them out partway. And the central question, did we bury these buildings ourselves? Or did we simply uncover them halfway and stop digging? Let's start with what's visible right in front of you. Boston's Beacon Hill neighborhood has buildings where the first floor sits below street level. And these aren't just stoops or entrance steps. You descend full staircases to reach what's marked as the main entrance. But the windows tell a different story. Stone lintels frame them, decorative keystones sit at the top, and carved details match the floors above ground. These aren't basement windows designed for storage. They're first-floor windows that happen to be underground. The Merchant's House Museum on East 4th Street in New York was built in 1832, and the basement level has 9-foot ceilings, formal rooms laid out for living, and windows with stonework identical to the parlor floor above it. The official line says the street was raised at some point, but the building was completed in 1832 when streets were already established, which raises the question of when exactly an entire neighborhood got raised, and why nobody thought to adjust the building height during construction. Chicago's downtown shows the same pattern in building after building. The Monadnock, the Rookery, and the Reliance Building all feature ornate basement levels with massive windows, finished stonework, and formal entryways. The Great Fire happened in 1871, and the standard story claims the city raised its streets afterward to improve drainage and install sewer systems. But these buildings weren't constructed until the 1880s and 90s, which was after the street raising supposedly took place. So why are their first floors still sitting underground? San Francisco's Jackson Square Historic District has entire rows of buildings with half-buried first floors, showing ornate iron columns, brick archways, and stone facades all below ground level. The city's explanation points to street raising after the fires of the 1850s, but look closely at what's underground. These are load-bearing architectural elements, first-floor columns that support the entire structure above them. And you don't bury your support columns and build new ones on top unless the building was already that way when you found it. Old Town Portland has buildings with 12-foot buried sections, and the famous Shanghai tunnels that run beneath the streets aren't actually tunnels at all. They're the original ground floors of buildings, now underground, complete with finished ceilings, brick walls, wooden floors, and doorways connecting one building to another at what used to be street level. The official story calls it street raising for flood control, but the tunnels reveal finished commercial spaces with details you wouldn't waste on a basement. Salt Lake City has entire blocks where you walk down into storefronts, and buildings like the ZCMI and the Eagle Gate feature elaborate underground levels with skylights. Those skylights now open to the sidewalk instead of the sky, which raises an obvious question. Why put a skylight in a basement? The answer is, you wouldn't, unless it wasn't a basement when someone built it. Old Sacramento gives you the clearest example of this pattern. The entire historic district sits one story below the modern city. And when you walk through Old Sacramento at what they call street level, you're actually on the second floor of the original buildings. The first floors exist below you, accessible through scattered stairways that lead down, and the California State Railroad Museum has displays showing the original street level, sitting 15 feet beneath where people walk today. Every building in a 6-block area was buried uniformly, all to the same depth. And here's the detail that tears apart the official story. The buried floors aren't rough, unfinished spaces thrown together for storage. They have hardwood floors, ornamental plaster on the ceilings, decorative tile work on the walls, gas lamp fixtures still mounted in place, and finished staircases with carved wooden banisters. These are formal architectural spaces built to be seen and used, now sitting underground where nobody was supposed to see them. The windows tell you everything you need to know. Basement windows are small, plain, and functional because their only job is letting light into storage areas. But these buried windows match the ones above street level in size, stonework, and decorative elements. In building after building, you can trace the pattern downward and watch first-floor windows, second-floor windows, and third-floor windows continue into what's labeled the basement, except those basement windows look exactly like first-floor windows because that's what they are. The stonework gives it away every time. Carved lintels, ornamental keystones, and detailed corbels cost serious money and serious labor, and nobody wastes expensive stonework on basement windows that face an alley. But if you thought you were building a first-floor window and the building ended up buried later, suddenly your expensive stonework ends up underground where it makes no sense. Ceiling height is another problem. Basements have low ceilings, usually 7 or 8 feet at most, because storage doesn't need height. But these buried floors have 12-foot ceilings, 14-foot ceilings, some even reaching 15 feet, complete with formal ceiling medallions, plaster crown molding, and chandeliers hanging in the middle. Who builds a 15-foot basement and hangs a chandelier in it? The floor plans don't work either. Basements are utilitarian by nature, designed for boiler rooms and storage with simple layouts that prioritize function. But maps of these buried levels show formal room divisions laid out like parlors, dining rooms, action commercial storefronts. Seattle's Underground Tour takes you through what used to be Pioneer Square's business district, now sitting underground, and the layout shows retail shops, hotels, and restaurants all finished as commercial spaces, not crude storage cellars. The official explanation claims cities raised their streets gradually over decades by adding fill dirt, laying new pavement, and building up layer by layer. Yes, this happened in some places, but the scale doesn't match what we're seeing. Seattle's version is the most detailed. The Great Fire of 1889 destroyed 31 blocks, and the city decided to raise streets anywhere from 8 to 30 feet to solve flooding problems. They built retaining walls, filled the space between buildings with dirt, and constructed new sidewalks at the higher level. Businesses kept operating from the original ground floor while construction continued above them. And once the new street level was established, merchants moved operations upstairs and abandoned the lower floors. That's how the story goes, but here's where it breaks down. 30 feet of filled dirt spread across 31 blocks equals 8.4 million cubic yards of material, and the question becomes where all of it came from. The official answer points to nearby hill regrading, specifically Denny Hill and Jackson Street, but Denny Hill regrading didn't start until 1903, which is 14 years after the fire. Jackson Street regrade happened decades later as well. So where did 8 million cubic yards of dirt come from in 1890? The labor problem gets worse when you do the math. Where moving that volume of material in 1890 meant horses, carts, and manual labor, nothing else. At 3 cubic yards per wagon, you're looking at 2.8 million wagon loads. Running 100 wagons per day continuously would take 77 years just to move the dirt, not counting the time needed for grading, wall construction, or paving. Even with 500 wagons working every single day, That's still 15 years to move the dirt alone. And supposedly, all of this happened while businesses stayed open. The story claims merchants operated from the old ground floor while new streets were being built 20 feet above their heads. Picture that for a moment. You're shopping in a store while horse-drawn wagons dump millions of tons of dirt overhead. Construction crews build retaining walls around you, and your ceiling is literally the new street being formed. But you can still buy groceries, and this goes on for 10 years. The economics don't work either. The official reason given is flood control, since Seattle's low-lying areas flooded during high tide, and raising the streets would solve drainage problems. But the cost would have bankrupted them. Labor for a decade, materials for millions of cubic yards of fill, building retaining walls for 31 blocks, constructing new sidewalks, new street surfaces, and new utility lines. All of this in the 1890s, when the entire city budget ran a few $100,000 per year. They bankrupted themselves to raise streets when they could have just built on higher ground. Chicago tells a similar story. After the 1871 fire destroyed the city, streets were raised to improve drainage and install modern sewers. But the fire burned the existing buildings down to nothing, so if you're rebuilding from scratch anyway, why not just build at the new height? Why would you construct a building with its first floor underground and then raise the street later? The timeline doesn't work either, since most of Chicago's famous buildings went up in the 1880s and 90s, which was after the raising supposedly happened, yet their first floors are still underground. Galveston's story gets even stranger. The 1900 hurricane killed 8,000 people in a single storm, and the city's response was to raise the entire island 17 feet. They jacked up over 2,000 structures, then pumped sand underneath them, and the whole process took 7 years. The engineering was impressive, but here's what doesn't make sense. Why not just move? The hurricane proved the island couldn't be inhabited safely at the existing elevation, and raising it 17 feet cost tens of millions of dollars, equivalent to $500 million today. For that kind of money, they could have relocated to the mainland and built a new city on high ground. Unless the buildings were already there and they needed them. Old Sacramento's story makes even less sense when you look at the details. The city flooded regularly in the 1850s and 60s, and the solution involved raising downtown 15 feet. But they didn't raise the buildings themselves, they just filled in dirt around them, which meant first floors became basements and second floors became the new ground level. Some business owners had to build new storefronts on the second floor. Entire staircases got enclosed in walls, and doorways were bricked over permanently. Why not tear down and rebuild? If flooding is the problem, and you're already spending the money to move 15 feet of dirt, demolition and new construction would cost less than the engineering nightmare of filling in around existing structures while keeping them operational. The only reason to keep the buildings is if you didn't build them in the first place and you needed them. The timeline creates another problem. This happened everywhere between 1850 and 1900, which is a 50-year window. Seattle in 1890, Chicago from 1870 to 1890, San Francisco in the 1850s, Portland in the 1870s, Galveston in 1900, Salt Lake City in the 1860s, Sacramento in the 1860s, and Boston from the 1830s through the 1860s. Dozens of cities following the same pattern. Streets raised, buildings buried, first floors turned into basements, all within 50 years. And this isn't just an American phenomenon. Europe shows the same thing. Edinburgh, Scotland has an entire buried city called Mary King's Close, where whole streets and buildings were sealed underground in the 1600s. The official story calls it plague quarantine, but the buried sections are fully finished buildings with multiple stories, all intact and sitting underground. Rome is famous for being buried. The ancient city sits 40 feet below modern street level. Fucking tourists visit underground ruins that were originally at ground level 2,000 years ago. The official explanation points to 2 millennia of rubble accumulation, but the math doesn't work. 40 feet in 2,000 years equals a quarter inch per year, yet Renaissance-era buildings constructed around 1500 AD are already 10 feet underground. That's 10 feet in 500 years, which works out to half an inch per year and doubles the earlier rate, meaning the accumulation supposedly accelerated for no clear reason. London has multiple buried levels stacked on top of each other. The Roman city sits 20 feet down, medieval streets are 10 feet down, and construction crews constantly discover new buried structures nobody knew existed. The official story calls it organic accumulation from garbage, and construction debris and demolition rubble piling up over centuries. But organic accumulation doesn't bury buildings uniformly. Natural buildup creates uneven surfaces, mounds in some areas and valleys in others, yet the buried levels in London are flat, consistent, and spread across the entire city. The timeline correlation gets suspicious when you line it up with other events. 1850 to 1900, the same period as the orphan trains moving 250,000 children with no verified parents. The same period as the World's Fairs, showcasing elaborate classical architecture, and then demolishing it within months. The same period as the insane asylum boom that institutionalized over 100,000 people. The same period as the Great Fires that destroyed Chicago in 1871, Boston in 1872, Seattle in 1889, Baltimore in 1904, and San Francisco in 1906. All within 50 years, and all of these events follow the same pattern, explaining away or destroying evidence of previous occupation. Orphan trains move children with no family history to erase their origins. Asylums locked up people who remembered things that didn't fit the official narrative. World's Fairs displayed Tartarian architecture and then demolished it before questions could be asked. Great Fires destroyed city centers right before rebuilding them in modern style. And buried buildings sealed original ground floors underground while creating new history at a higher level. What if these aren't separate events? What if they're all part of the same thing? Create a coordinated reset of the historical record? Let's examine the official explanations one by one and see if they hold up under scrutiny. Explanation 1 claims organic accumulation. Cities naturally rise over time as debris, garbage, and construction material pile up, and eventually the street level climbs higher, while old buildings sink into the ground. The problem is the rate doesn't match reality. Organic accumulation happens slowly and unevenly, maybe an inch every decade at most. Burying a 12-foot floor would take over 1,000 years at that rate. But these cities claim it happened in 50 years or less. And the burial is uniform across entire city blocks, all at the same level, not the random mounds you'd expect from natural buildup. Explanation 2 points to flood control. The cities in low-lying areas raised their streets to prevent flooding by bringing in fill dirt, building up the roads, and leaving the buildings at the original level. The problem is the cost and labor don't make sense. Moving millions of cubic yards of dirt with 1800s technology would take decades and drain city budgets completely. And if flooding is the actual problem, why keep buildings that are now half buried instead of just rebuilding them at the new height? Explanation 3 blames fire rebuilding. After major fires destroyed cities, they rebuilt at a higher level to install modern infrastructure like sewers and utility lines. But if the fire destroyed the buildings, just build new ones at whatever height you want. Why would you construct buildings with their first floors underground? And many of these buried buildings were built before the fires or after them, so the fire explanation doesn't cover those cases. Explanation 4 suggests gradual infrastructure improvement. As cities modernized, they added pavement layers, utility lines, and improved drainage systems. And each addition raised the street slightly until it added up over decades. Pavement layers are inches thick, not feet. You can't bury a 15-foot floor with pavement improvements, and utility lines run underground, so they don't require raising the street surface at all. None of these explanations work for the scale we're seeing, the timeline involved, or the uniformity of the burial. Let's talk about the alternative theory, which suggests the buildings were already buried when people found them. The mud flood theory proposes a catastrophic event, possibly an earthquake, flood, liquefaction, volcanic ash, or some combination that buried cities rapidly. Not gradually over decades, but suddenly, with feet of mud, ash, or sediment covering ground floors in days or weeks. The event was either global or at least widespread across the northern hemisphere, and it happened somewhere in the early to mid-1800s. After the event, survivors or new inhabitants dug out what they could. They excavated down to accessible levels, sometimes reaching the second floor and calling it the first floor, sometimes only clearing partial levels and leaving basements half buried. They repurposed what they found and rewrote the history to claim they'd built it all themselves. This theory explains several things the official story can't. It explains why buried floors are finished and ornate. They were designed to be seen because they were originally ground floors, and when the mud came, it buried them intact with all their decorative elements in place. It explains the uniform burial depth. A sudden deposition event covers an area evenly, but gradual accumulation doesn't work that way. The fact that entire city blocks are buried to the same level suggests a single event, not decades of slow buildup. It explains the timeline. 1850 to 1900 wasn't when cities raised streets. It was when they finished excavating and reestablishing infrastructure after the event. The so-called raising was actually the digging out process, and the new street level is simply how far down they managed to excavate before stopping. It explains why they kept half-buried buildings instead of rebuilding from scratch. Because they didn't build them in the first place, they found them. And the buildings were more advanced than what they could construct themselves, so they repurposed them and claimed ownership. It explains the global pattern. If this were just American urban development, fine, maybe it's a coincidence. But it's Edinburgh, Rome, London, Paris, cities all over the world. A coordinated global engineering project to raise streets everywhere? Or a global event that buried cities? And it explains the other reset evidence. If a catastrophic event buried cities, it also displaced massive populations, which creates orphans with no verifiable families. It erased records, making it easy to rewrite history however you wanted. It destroyed old architecture, convenient for anyone trying to hide it. And it left survivors confused, traumatized, possibly suffering from what we'd call mental illness. Perfect candidates for asylums where they could be silenced permanently. The 1850s through 1900s weren't a period of progress and development. They were a period of recovery and cover-up. Here's what we know for certain. Dozens of cities have buildings with elaborate first floors buried underground, and those floors feature ornate stonework, high ceilings, formal layouts, and finished details. Official explanations claim streets were raised gradually or rebuilt after fires, but the scale, cost, and timeline don't support that story. Moving millions of cubic yards of dirt with 1800s technology would take decades and cost fortunes. Cities supposedly did this while staying operational, rebuilding after fires, and maintaining normal commerce. The burial happened worldwide in a 50-year window, the same period as orphan trains, asylum booms, World's Fair demolitions, and Great Fires. Here's the question you're not supposed to ask. Did we bury our buildings on purpose? Or did we dig them up, stop halfway, and call the second floor the first?